Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
Welcome. Today's guest is Dr. Tim Jacobs. He is Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine at Quincy Medical Group. He is board certified with the American Osteopathic Association in Family Medicine. Dr. Jacobs is a member of the Quincy Civil War Roundtable and the Historical Society of Quincy and Adams County. He has researched and presented on several historical topics, including the Spanish flu, influenza epidemic of 1918, and numerous Civil War subjects. Today, he will explain the amazing and curious story of the Ruttle family and the discovered sword in the wall. Welcome, Dr. Jacobs.
Well, thanks, Rob. It's great to be here, and I think we're going to have a good program and tell people some things that they don't know.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. We'll get into it, but it's just such a cool story.
Truly amazing where you go when you pull on the threads of history.
Yes, definitely. Well, it's tradition, Dr. Jacobs, to have a featured beer to accompany our conversation. Since you're a big baseball fan and Chicago Cub fan, which I won't hold against you too much, the selection today is the No. 6 Classic American Lager from Urban Chestnut Brewing Company in the Gateway City. This beer was made from a recipe that predates Prohibition and was brewed to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Stan the Man Musial's birth. Of the Cardinal great, famous baseball commissioner Ford Frick once said, "Here stands baseball's perfect warrior. Here stands baseball's perfect knight." So in honor of baseball's perfect warrior, we have the classic No. 6 American Lager. If listeners want to join us they can find selections from the Urban Chestnut Brewing Company at Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. You can make a suggestion for future feature beers by subscribing and leaving a comment. If your selection is featured, you'll win a $10 gift card from Hy-Vee, so please subscribe and leave a comment. So the curious tale of this sword in the wall. It's an 1840 model U.S. cavalry saber made by Schnitzler and Kirschbaum of Germany. Dr. Jacobs, can you describe the story of the sword and how it was discovered and the astounding history of the Ruttle family?
About 2.5, 3 years ago, a young man brought a sword into the Historical Society with the story that he was remodeling a house in Hannibal. He tore down a wall, and this sword was there. He knew it was a Civil War sword, but he didn't know much about it, so he brought it to the Historical Society and asked us if we could do a little research on it, which we were able to do. And as you said, it was a U.S. Cavalry Saber 1840. Schnitzler and Kirschbaum was a common sword maker in Germany, and many of the British and Civil War American infantry officers used this sword. What we found on the sword was that there was an inscription etched on the scabbard, so we were able to do a little more research. That inscription was William D. Ruddell, captain of Company B, 78th Illinois Infantry Regiment. So we had a bit of local history because we know that the 78th had several regiments that came into the Civil War from this area. So we go back, and William Ruddell was born in Ursa, Illinois, and he was married to Melissa Grimes. He was a farmer, and in 1862, he enlisted in the American Civil War as a first lieutenant with, again, Company B of the 78th, which we'd saw on the scabbard. Well, at some point, he was promoted from first lieutenant to captain. I've read a lot about the 78th. I don't know a lot about Captain Ruttle, but we do know that he was wounded during the Battle of Atlanta. He did survive the rest of the war and mustered out in 1865 and returned to this area as a farmer in the Ursa area.
You know, sometimes local individuals who are interested in the Civil War, they don't realize how our local soldiers ended up, maybe they started in Missouri or something like that, but they made their way with the Army across the country. And in this case, he's fighting at the Battle of Atlanta, and that's in 1864?
Yeah, 1864 toward the end, yeah.
So that means he was with the Army that entire time. It always amazes me about American soldiers to do what's asked and to have a farm boy from Ursa to be with the Army during that time period and end up getting injured in Atlanta. That in itself, even though we, as you mentioned, we don't have a great deal of information about Captain Ruttle, but that has to be an interesting story in itself.
Well, the 78th, there's even a book about them called In the Thickest of the Fighting. And they truly were one of the lead regiments that were in many of the battles in the Western Theater. And certainly the Battle of Atlanta was a brutal time. And yes, he went. He was there, and fortunately, he did make it through the war.
He wasn't the only Quincian or Adams County resident to be injured down there. I did some research on Captain Piggott, and he was injured at the Battle of Resaca, which is right outside of Atlanta. And we know that the Confederacy, they were fighting very intensely to maintain control of Atlanta. That was a key point from them, especially with, they already had difficulty with their supplies and supplying their army. When they lost Atlanta, that was an incredible blow to the Confederacy.
Yeah, I think that was truly the beginning, the end, when Sherman was able to go there and do that. But you're right. So many of the boys from this area, my great-great-grandfather in the 50th Illinois Infantry at the savage small Battle of Allatoona Pass was right there, and those were mostly Adams County boys in the 50th. So yeah, they left Adams County and were in the thick of everything.
And we owe all our American soldiers a debt, but they're fighting for the Union.
Absolutely.
And we have the Union today, and America has grown into what it is. We owe those. And this conversation helps with that, to remember the sacrifice that they made, and not just World War II, because it's easier to remember World War II and Vietnam, but even in the Civil War, we owe them a debt of gratitude also.
No question about it. They were pretty rugged fellows. I don't know if I could do that today, to leave your home but
for years.
And the other problem is that not only were they fighting an enemy, disease killed two men for every man that died on the battlefield. So you had other fronts that you were fighting just besides the Confederacy.
That's a problem even in the modern military, but nowhere near the issue that it was in the past. They've done so much work with immunizations and so forth. When I was in basic training, I remember walking through a door, getting shot in both arms, stepping forward, getting two more, stepping forward, getting two more, and then entering and getting one in my buttocks.
And don't move, because you'll have a bloody streak on your arm.
Right.
I remember.
And all of that really is to protect the Army.
Yeah.
And I know Washington, even going back to that, not kind of off topic a little bit, but that's been an issue in the Army to deal with disease for quite a long time. We do a good job of it today, but it certainly hasn't gone away, especially with the problems that we see today.
Well, with the advance in medicine, and so many of the advances of medicine were due to the military. I know in Vietnam, the advances in burn care, and certainly the advances in surgery during Korea. So the medical field has really made strides, and unfortunately because of conflict.
And we know that William Ruddell was injured, so he survived.
He did survive, and he came back to Adams County, and he farmed in Ursa for about 10 years before he moved to Missouri, and he lived in the county above St. Joe, and we know he was elected as the county treasurer, and he passed away there in 1888 and is buried there. We can get a copy of his military stone as well as his other stone. So, but it's amazing that he did all these things, but we really don't know a lot about him. We do know that we found a sword in the wall that belonged to him.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But that's not where you mentioned that thread that you pulled on. So you continue to pull on the thread. And what'd you find after that?
Well, we're going to do a little genealogy, but we're going to do it in reverse chronology. So we're going to talk just shortly about William's father, who was John Ruddell, who was born in 1812 in Kentucky, moved with his family to Adams County in 1829, and was married. He did serve very shortly in the Black Hawk War, which, of course, we know was a very short war, so no wonder he served very shortly.
And several people from this area were called out in the militia and served in the Black Hawk War. And over in Sangamon County, we know that Abraham Lincoln served briefly in the Black Hawk War. And not only that, from our area, we know that a lot of people came from Kentucky, so that's not surprising. In 1829, that's only 7 years after John Wood comes here on a permanent basis, which is in, I think, November of 1822. Yeah. He'd been here before that, but permanently he stayed in 1822. So he's one of the earliest residents of Adams County.
He is a very early resident, and we'll find out how he got here in a little bit. Again, he did serve as township supervisor, and he died in 1896. His obituary said he was the oldest farmer in Adams County at the time. He was about almost 84 years old. And I thought that was kind of an odd statement, but then as I looked up, the life expectancy in 1896 was about 44 years.
Wow.
And certainly that was brought down by infant mortality and a lot of childhood illness, which if you could live till you were about a teenager, your life expectancy went up quite a bit. But I thought that was an interesting statement in his obituary. Now we're going to get to the really interesting part.
All right.
We're going to get to William Ruddell's grandfather, John Ruddell's father, Stephen Ruddell, who was born in 1768 in Kentucky. His father was Captain Isaac Ruttle, who had a little fort called Ruttle Station just south of Lexington, Kentucky. Well, 1780, this was during the Revolutionary War. Ruttle Station was attacked by Captain Byrd with about 200 British soldiers and a contingent of American Indians numbering somewhere between 600 and 800. Well, there was a small skirmish because the militia at Ruttle Station was not very large. And after this skirmish, the Ruttle Station, the rudimentary fort, was surrounded, and so Captain Ruttle and Captain Byrd settled on a surrender terms. Well, the surrender terms were that the families were supposed to stay together. Well, that was fine for the British, but do you ever trust the British?
Not at that time.
No. But the Indians were not shackled by that. And so Stephen Ruddell was 12 years old. His brother Abram was 9 years old, and they were taken to live with the Shawnee tribe.
And that was not uncommon. These tribes would have problems because of constant warfare among each other, or disease that was brought about generally by contact with some sort of white settlement. Mm-hmm. And they needed warriors and just people for the tribe to build the tribe up. The other interesting thing that I remember about Native Americans was that they liked to have European women of European descent, white women, because they were more fertile.
Absolutely.
And so that was common as well. So when people hear that people were taken into the tribe, like in this circumstance, that's not uncommon and happened in my family. In our history, I can tell you about that in a second, but that's certainly not uncommon.
And you're right, especially the Plains Indians who rode horses all the time. Their females were their infertility was classic. And so that's one reason that many white women, especially in the Plains Indians, were taken as wives. So, at any rate, Stephen Ruddell was adopted by Chief Blackfish, who was a very prominent Shawnee chief. And they had a ceremony where they actually cut the boy's ears and bled the white blood out of them. And Chief Blackfish...
Now, as a doctor, is that how it works, Dr. Jacobs?
Well, I guess in
Indian
medicine, there is a spiritual aspect to that.
Okay.
So we'll go with that. But Chief Blackfish said this when he did this, "My son, you are now flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone. By the ceremony performed this day, every drop of white blood was washed from your veins. You were taken into the Shawnee Nation." So, Stephen Ruddell and his brother, Abram, were part of the Shawnee Nation and the tribe and adopted sons of Chief Blackfish. Stephen's name was Sidamantha, which meant big fish. His adopted brothers were Pasquanaki, Tecumseh, and Lalaway. And we would know those today as Tecumseh, who was a great warrior in the future of the Shawnee Nation, and the prophet. So these were Stephen Ruddell's stepbrothers.
So from this sword, and some individual finds a sword in a wall, brings it into the Historical Society, and I like the imagery of that you mentioned of pulling on the thread. Mm-hmm. And not only does it lead back to just outside of this area, a generation or two, it leads back to some of the most influential Shawnee leaders or Indian leaders mm-hmm. of that time period. Yeah. And they grew up together. Mm-hmm. So he grew up with Tecumseh and the prophet, which I know as Tenskwatawa. Mm-hmm. And, of course, they have an interesting story as well out in the Indiana territory. Mm-hmm. But that's an amazing connection from a local person going back in generations to being adopted brothers with Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa.
You know, these are stories you can't even make up. This is much better than any fiction that you could find. But being the same age as Tecumseh, Stephen and Tecumseh were, or as I should say, big fish, were inseparable. They liked to do the same things. They liked to go roam around the woods. They liked to hunt. They liked to fish. And they were becoming warriors, especially after the death of their father, Blackfish. Tecumseh would become one of the main tribal warriors in the Shawnee Nation.
Well, Tecumseh had the idea, and it's a forward-thinking idea, especially for a Native American, to have a confederacy. Mm-hmm. And he wanted that confederacy to encompass not only Indian tribes that were out in Ohio and Indiana, but down into Mississippi mm-hmm. and Georgia. I mean, he had a really forward-thinking idea. But he was really the warrior of that pair between mm-hmm. Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh.
Mm-hmm. The prophet would be more of a spiritual fellow. Interestingly enough, at one point he was somewhat of he had a fondness for liquor, and he had kind of an epiphany, and that's when he delved deeply into Indian spirituality and really changed the way he lived.
You know, when I hear about that story, I always think about the human condition, and it's not uncommon from how modern people think and so forth to say, we don't like the way that things are currently functioning. We got to get back to the way it used to be. Mm-hmm. And that's really what the prophet was preaching. Yeah. And if we get back to the way it used to be, then we're going to recapture our life. It's a little naive, but it's more spiritual. Mm-hmm. And it motivated some tribes. Obviously, the tribes had been so separated for so long, it was hard to coalesce together into any formidable group that Tecumseh was trying to accomplish. But I just think that That's not uncommon in the human condition to think that way, like Tenskwatawa. And it's certainly not uncommon for people to be attracted to that. Let's get back to the way it was when we weren't beholden to another group from the outside, or in this case, alcohol and guns and things that Tenskwatawa thought if we can eliminate those things, we'll get back to the purity of the way it used to be.
And he was very successful because he did have a lot of the Indians that followed him to Indiana. And, of course, that's another story. But it's certainly the opposite of Tecumseh because he did want to form this confederacy to keep the whites from taking the land. And he did go all over to as many tribes as he could find. And unfortunately, many of them didn't want anything to do with him.
So did you find out in your research where Ruttle was at during this time period of leading up to the Battle of Tippecanoe?
We'll get to that. I can't remember what year Tippecanoe was.
1811, I believe.
1811. He'd already been back.
November 7th, 1811 was the battle. Yeah. And just to give people some context, what happens in that is Major General William Henry Harrison realized, the government realized, that the tribes out there were trying to develop into a confederacy, and it was his job to smash that because the people out on the frontier feared any time that native groups were banding together because there had been problems even from the earliest times of colonial days on into 1811. Anytime they were on the frontier with those groups that were right on the front edge of that. And so William Henry Harrison was sent out there. He encounters Prophetstown, which was set up, and you mentioned in the Indiana Territory by Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, the Prophet. The Prophet is there, but Tecumseh is not. Tecumseh is really the warrior of those two. He should have waited. I don't know if that was even an option, but the Prophet really didn't have the wherewithal to have any sort of military engagement without Tecumseh being there. But that doesn't happen. In fact, William Henry Harrison, they start having a dialogue initially, but William Henry Harrison doesn't trust Tenskwatawa or the Indians either, so he's totally prepared. He has the ammunition already distributed. They're in a very defensive position, and at night they're actually attacked. Very fierce fighting between Harrison's troops and the Indians from Prophetstown, and in the end, a counterattack by William Henry Harrison decides the Battle of Tippecanoe, and Tecumseh is not even there.
No, he's over in Ohio, and he's at that point still trying to get tribes to coalesce. And unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of success. He did have some success, though. I think the best story I came up with was when he went down to the area of Alabama, and he was talking with a tribe, and I can't remember, there's a creek maybe down there. And they were not really buying his story. And he said, well, I'm going to go back north, and I'm going to stamp my foot on the ground, and all of your teepee, well, they wouldn't be teepees, but all your wigwams are going to fall down. Well, a couple of weeks later, there was an earthquake, and the Creek's villages were destroyed. And you know what they did? They packed up and went to Ohio and joined Tecumseh. So it's just one of those funny stories that you hear.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
And I know that he did go down into the South. It wasn't just out in Ohio. That's the other thing that's striking about that is the distance they would have to travel. What he was truly trying to do to combine the tribes from Georgia and Mississippi and so forth with the tribes in Ohio. That is an ambitious plan.
Oh, he went into even into upstate New York, trying to get those tribes to come, but limited success. Well, at any rate, so Stephen Ruddell and his adopted brothers were having a little fun. In 1795, there was a little lull in the animosity and the fighting between Indians and whites. And at that point, Stephen Ruddell decided that, and he was a warrior of his own. Wright had his own tribe of warriors that followed him, but he decided he might go check into his white ancestry at this point. And he went up into Ohio. I can't remember, Greenville, I think. And the man who was in charge was General Mad Anthony Wayne. Interesting chap, because Mad Anthony Wayne had been sent west by none other than George Washington, because George Washington really didn't like him. He was known as kind of a drunkard and a womanizer, and so George Washington, to get him out of the East Coast, sent him to manage the Indian problem.
That's a way to get rid of him.
And
not only that, as we know, Washington was not into those things.
No. And so he sent Mad Anthony Wayne out there to be rid of him. At any rate, these Indians show up, and they were surprised because this one could speak a little rudimentary English, and that was Stephen Ruddell. And so he starts telling them a little bit of the story, and the captain said, well, I gotta get General Wayne. So he came out and talked with him, and he said, well, I know your father. I know Captain Isaac Ruttle. And he said, I know where he's at. And a few days later, the family was reunited. So
that thread that you talked about, what a connection.
Yeah.
You know, Mad Anthony Wayne, and then he knows Captain Isaac Ruttle, and then the connection is made between father and son again.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, Abram, who was 3 years younger, had pretty much gone native at this point. He didn't speak any English. They didn't even recognize him. His parents did not even recognize him. They at least recognized Stephen. But Abram had pretty much gone native, and later on he would have trouble assimilating back into white society. So Stephen Ruddell and Abram go back to Kentucky, to Ruttle Station. They're living there, and in 1810, Stephen Ruddell is ordained a minister of the gospel. And for a couple of years, he ministers to Indian tribes, and then he moves to Pike County, Missouri, where he starts the Bushy Creek Baptist Church, which is still there today.
So he leaves through that connection with General Wayne.
Mm-hmm.
He gets reconnected with his father. Him and his brother then go back to his original family. Yeah. His brother's having some difficulty, which is totally understandable.
Mm-hmm.
But then,
after 15 years with the natives.
Right. I could see that being incredibly difficult, even throughout his life.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of, and you said that was in 1795?
1795, yeah.
So the brothers then, and we'll call them brothers,
mm-hmm.
Tecumseh and Tecumseh and the Ruttle brothers are separated at 1795. And then they move in different directions. And, of course, we mentioned what happens with Tecumseh and Tecumseh. And now those brothers are separated from one another.
After 15 years of being together, yes, they would. The other boys would go back to white society, and of course, Tecumseh would side with the British in the War of 1812 and be killed in battle.
He gets killed in the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. I think in 1813, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So Stephen Ruddell is now in Pike County, Missouri, in Louisiana, started his church. And in 1829, as we said about his son John Ruddell, they came to Ursa, Illinois, where he founded the first Christian church, which is still there.
So what year was that, Dr. Jacobs?
1829.
Wow. So see, that's before the first church was even established in Quincy, because the first congregation in Quincy was established in 1830. And the first church wasn't constructed to 1832. Mm-hmm. So that even predates the churches in Quincy.
And so he's the minister, and he founds the church. And again, as I say, it's still there. So
the church building is still there?
Well, the
congregation.
The congregation is still there. I don't think it's the same building, but
that would be pretty amazing.
Yeah. And in 1845, Stephen Ruddell passes away. He's buried on the family farm, but there is a monument up at Ursa Cemetery, and it very much lays out the story that we have just talked about. The inscription on that stone says, Stephen was captured by Indians at age 12 in the Revolutionary War when Ruddell's station was attacked by the British under Captain Byrd, had all the white blood washed out, and was a warrior. He married a squaw and returned to Kentucky after the treaty. Ordained a minister of the gospel in 1810, founded the Ursa Christian Church. His other wives were, and they're listed. Interesting thing about the squaw that went back to...
I was going to ask about that.
Oh, yeah, that's a story in itself. Well, you can just imagine that she did not do well with white society. And so after a couple of months, she was miserable. And Stephen said, well, you can go home. And he gave her a pony and a mule, I think. And she went back to the tribe in Ohio.
There are several cases where women of European descent, so white women, would be incorporated into tribes, and then they would be encountered through the army or so forth, and they would be asked, do you want to come with us? And many of them rejected, they wanted to stay with the tribe. So I can see that connection, especially for someone who was of, she was of Indian descent.
Story for a different day, but yes, Quanah Parker, the great... he was, can't remember the tribe, but Quanah Parker became a chief. His mother was white, and she went back to the white society under duress, and she did not do well. And so that was Cheyenne.
Cheyenne. Okay.
Yeah. And so we have actually 4 generations: Captain Isaac Parker, or Captain Isaac Ruddell, Stephen Ruddell, John Ruddell, and our man who had the sword that we don't know how it got in the wall, but we do know that it traveled during the Civil War, and now we know that thread of history goes all the way back to the Revolution, and kind of ties our history all together. And knowing we were a much smaller country, it seemed as if everyone knew everyone or somehow. But it's just a great story to find a sword and then find this local history that goes all the way into our national history.
That's totally an amazing story. I was going to tell you a little bit about my family. I did a little digging into the Connor side of my family. So it had been my great-grandmother's maiden name. But I knew my great-grandmother. She was alive until I was probably 19. So I'd known her all of my life. And I didn't know a lot about her family. I knew her father's name, found his grave, but I didn't know anything beyond that. So I elicited the help of Jean at the Historical Society. Mm-hmm. She did some work. She traced that lineage all the way back to the person who left from Ireland. His name was Richard O'Connor. When he arrived in America, took the O off, and it was just Connor. He fought in the American Revolution. He married it was a white woman, but he encountered a tribe similar to what we've been talking about, and he worked out a deal with the tribe so he could marry the woman, and the deal was the firstborn had to go back to the tribe. So that firstborn, I think his name was James, he goes back to the tribe. He's there until age 9. Well, that's my great, whatever grandfather. So this is all in my family line. And then his son fought in the Civil War, which led to and he's buried at the Veterans Home. Didn't know any of this information. And so I would encourage anyone to look into their family history. You don't even know how interesting your own family can be.
Well, I think the genealogy aspect of this is pretty amazing. And I know when I started getting interested in the Civil War, it was because I found my great-great-grandfather was in the 50th Illinois Infantry and was wounded at Shiloh, and that just kind of cascaded into other Civil War history. But I think genealogy is a great place to start. And
so was he with the 50th at Shiloh?
He was with the 50th, yes.
So what happened? What happens there? Like, what happens to him?
He was wounded in the arm the same day that Moses Bain had his arm amputated by his brother. And he did survive. It was a minor wound, and he went on through the rest of the Civil War. And certainly at Allatoona Pass, as I mentioned before, the 50th was mightily engaged, and that was a brutal battle. But then,
what rank did he achieve?
He ended up being a corporal, so he did get a little bit of advancement.
The Army needs corporals just as much as they need generals. I can tell you that.
That's right. Sergeant majors are in big demand, and I always thought the first sergeant when I was in the military was probably the guy that did most of the work.
Well, now I was a commander, so I would say together, me and the first sergeant did that. No, but you're right. You're definitely right.
Well, you have to remember, I did 4 years as a enlisted, and I got to be a sergeant. But then I went back in as a medical officer. So
what time did you serve?
I was in the Air Force during Vietnam.
During Vietnam,
but I did not have to go to Vietnam because they did not have the job that I did. Not exist in Vietnam.
Okay.
Working on nuclear weapons, we didn't have them in theater there. So I got.
And that certainly wasn't at the time period we were discussing just now.
No, not at all. But I recently did find, I was out in Camp Point where I grew up and doing some research, and I had a cousin named Samuel Jacobs who was captured at Chickamauga, went to Andersonville, and survived. And they have some of his Civil War papers out there at the little library museum at Camp Point. So I have another thread to pull.
So if someone wants to hear your presentation, are you planning on giving it to different groups, maybe even using a different method like Zoom or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I could certainly do that. I've given it last fall at the Genealogy Society, and I have to say it was very well received because
I could see where they really would like that because once you start looking back in history, as I mentioned in my own family, it reveals all kinds of interesting stories. Yeah. So I could see where they would really like that.
And I was supposed to give it at Notre Dame High School this spring, but that got waylaid because of our present circumstances. So
we're trying to do more things at the Historical Society with Zoom. And I might reach out to you, and maybe we can do a Zoom call with just the Historical Society members. And, of course, the Civil War Roundtable can be sent the link as well. Because I think the story needs to get out, and it all starts with just finding a sword in the wall.
Yeah, and that's why I named it The Sword in the Wall, because it's a captivating way to start. And then when you hear the story, it just you kind of shake your head and say, you really can't make this thing up.
So I know you're involved with the symposium that's coming up, which we've had for a few years. Can you give us an idea of what's planned for the symposium this coming spring?
Yeah, it's going to be, again, based on the Civil War. We're going to have a couple of speakers we've had before. Tim Good, who's over at the Lincoln Home, very, very good speaker. And we don't know his topic yet. Sam Wheeler, our state historian, who always spins a tale. You never quite know where he's coming from. That first year that we had him and he started talking about Groucho Marx when he was supposed to be talking about General Grant, I kept shaking my head, but he's the one that pulled that off. And
now, if you can make that connection,
absolutely,
you got to be pretty good.
But I think our speaker who's coming from out of town, Tim Smith, very, very well read on the Western theater. He's written extensively on Shiloh, Vicksburg. His most recent book is The Real Horse Soldier, about General Gerson's raid. And one of the reasons that we got him here to Quincy at a little reduced rate is we promised that he could see Colonel Prince's house. And he is a big fan of Colonel Prince, who rode with Gerson on that raid. Another Quincyan.
And our history is so rich and full and developed. And it's fortunate that we have the Civil War Roundtable and the Historical Society and our museums to capture our history. I'm pretty proud of the fact that the Historical Society has been doing it since 1896. That's pretty good. And the programs that we, as you mentioned, are absolutely high quality. And so I would certainly invite anybody to come to these programs. You're going to get a very interesting, group of information and tales and stories, and you can speak with other people from other places. I'm really proud of our history here locally, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And it is rich. And I think if people hear the stories, they get so involved because they want to know more. And we just love telling the stories.
You think you might tell this story at the symposium? You should. I mean, that should be something that you could roll out as a.
I think we could probably do that.
It's just so amazing that it starts with a sword in the wall and ends up with all these connections with Tecumseh. And, I made a connection when I was looking at the topic. So Prophetstown is right outside of Lafayette, Indiana. Mm-hmm. And Lafayette, Indiana's courthouse is the exact, not a replica, but it was built at the same time as our original courthouse here in Adams County, which was destroyed the day that Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945.
Right.
And so if anyone's interested, what did the old Adams County courthouse look like, they can go to the Lafayette, Indiana courthouse, and those two are exactly the same. I didn't know. Did you know that?
I did not know that. Now, I had a nephew that went to Purdue, so I've been to Lafayette or West Lafayette. But next time I go, I'm going to have to
definitely
to
do that and do a quick Google search and see how amazing that building was. Now, we have old pictures that look phenomenal, and it's too bad that we lost that building to the tornado there in 1945. But that's an exact. It's not a replica, but it's the exact design. There were similar designs. So if somebody wants to know, all they got to do is look. And I noticed that, at Prophetstown was right outside of Lafayette, Indiana.
Yeah. That and that same storm that took our courthouse took the spires off the Jewish temple.
And it hit, I think, St. Peter's Church, which then had to be reconstructed. Yeah. Probably a number of other buildings. The other thing that it hit, with a little bit of a Civil War connection, was the old Saloon No. 9 building.
Oh, yeah.
which the Historical Society has the stone sign, which I don't think that sign goes back to the Lincoln and Douglas time. But the building was there with the old No. 9 sign, and that's actually in the livery there at the Historical Society.
That the place of the famous rum sweat?
Yes, the place of the rum sweat. So what does the Civil War Roundtable have going on?
Well, of course, we've been under wraps here for the last few months, but hopefully we're going to get started back in the fall. And we have a lady coming who had talked to us before, who is a family member of the Mosby family from General Mosby in Virginia. And she's going to talk about her family in Missouri. And we're still working on some other things. And we're still doing our memorials. And we need to do Louisa Mertz. We were supposed to do that this spring, and it got waylaid. We're going to do Sergeant Higgins, who took a Civil War Medal of Honor at Vicksburg and actually was put up for that Medal of Honor by the Confederates because of his bravery. So,
wow.
So I think we're going to do that. He's buried in Hannibal. And so we have a couple things. And then, of course, our symposium next April, and the fourth speaker is going to be Kurt Fields, who we've had here several times, and his portrayal of General and President Grant is always just spot on. And so for anyone who hasn't seen him, they need to see him, and for anyone who has seen him, they'll want to see him again.
And I like our local connection to Grant. Now, granted, he, no pun intended, he made his way across Illinois, and I always like to say that he entered the Civil War right here in Quincy. He crossed the river, and he goes from, Missouri was a Union-held territory, but that's where the problems were at. And so when he crossed the river, that's when he enters the Civil War. So I always like to think that General Grant entered the Civil War right here in Quincy.
And he ended up having a fairly good career.
He did. It's I didn't think about that, but he really did.
Yeah.
And he's such an interesting character, never gets enough credit. And there's a couple of books that I enjoyed both from Chernow and Ron White. But the American Ulysses, I think, is my favorite. I really enjoy American Ulysses. I don't know, as a Civil War historian, if you would concur.
I really like both those books, but if you're going to read about Grant, I still like the memoirs the best.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the literary prowess for a guy who was known as a hard-charging general, the guy could just write fantastically and write to the point. And I think that's why his orders were so concise and so clear, is that he could write so well. And and having a little connection with him is really fantastic.
Cool. It's really cool. Yeah. So if somebody wants to be involved in the Civil War Roundtable, how do they become a member?
We're a pretty loose group. We try and publish our meetings, and hopefully we'll be having meetings again in September. We do publish a newsletter, and all you have to do is get a hold of me, and I can get you on the newsletter, which is emailed. And you can get a hold of me through the Historical Society, or I don't know, other than my email.
Well, you can contact the Historical Society. If you go to the Historical Society's website, just send a message through the link there, and we can get to Dr. Jacobs, no problem whatsoever. So I know you're involved in all kinds of research. You find little topics that you look at. You got anything you're thinking of now, or what's the next thing you're looking at?
Actually, I try and do one or two talks to the roundtable every year, and because of the COVID, I've been reading a lot more. And my big topic right now is I'm doing going to get a program going on Ely Parker. Colonel Parker is, I think, just a most interesting figure that we don't think about all the time. But for a fellow who they wouldn't let into the Union Army because he was an Indian at the start of the war, for him to be at Appomattox writing those orders and of surrender for Grant.
So was he was with Grant that whole time?
Yeah.
So did he come from Galena?
No, he was actually from New York, but he was an engineer by trade. And they were putting up a customs house in Galena about 1858. That's where he first met Grant.
Okay.
So it predates the Civil War. But then when they finally started letting Indians into the war because they needed soldiers, but Grant grabbed on to Ely Parker, and he never left his side once he came east.
Grant has that way about those who are involved with him. Once he's incredibly loyal to them, and they are incredibly loyal to him, and that says something about his leadership, especially General Sherman, who could have, at least later, used his success to maybe level or become even with Grant, or maybe even eclipse him in some ways. Never interested in that. Always completely loyal. And I think that says a lot about General Grant's leadership and his personality.
Yeah, there was so much politics, especially in the eastern Eastern Theater in the Civil War, and even some in the Western Theater.
Sure.
Because Sherman did not agree with Grant's approach to Vicksburg. But afterwards, he said it was brilliant.
Right.
And he never questioned him again. And I think when you look at the way Grant and Sherman juxtaposed each other in their different theaters, they just worked so well together. But I think you're right. It was the loyalty that Sherman developed to Grant, where he would not question anything after Vicksburg.
And that becomes the quintessential generalship moment for Grant is Vicksburg. Even today, it's studied as, just an amazing. And Grant always had the ability to look at things differently than others, even beyond Robert E. Lee. He looked at things in a much strategic sense. I always considered Grant as a modern American general, maybe the very first one, because before that, it was always about battlefield tactics and tactical type of situation. In Grant's case, he's looking at the economy. He's looking at transportation, all of the things that a modern general has to concern themselves with. And from my perspective, he's the first modern American general.
I've always had this theory.
And he doesn't get enough credit for that.
No.
And there's a whole series of reasons for that, but he doesn't get enough credit for that.
Well, I think the resurgence of Grant's popularity is well-deserved because the historians that were trying to prop up the South early in last century,
Sure.
they had to have a foil, and he was the foil. But I've always had a theory that some of the best generals had been quartermasters, and Grant had been a quartermaster in the Mexican War. And so he understood those logistics and the ammunition and the food.
Which he didn't want to do,
No.
and it turned out to be the very best duty that he could possibly have for later in his career. You're absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
And that is not uncommon today. Modern commanders, generals have to understand supply, or they're not going to be effective.
Yeah, you have to know the logistics, or you will not be successful. And
So I really enjoy talking about General Grant. Maybe someday you can come back and we'll just have a whole conversation on General Grant.
That would be fine. Or another one of my favorite generals, Stonewall Jackson.
Sure.
Yeah.
Now, I think in his case, I always felt he was more of a tactical general. Am I wrong about that?
No, I think so, but he was very, very good at it. He saw the battlefield probably better than anyone in the South, including Robert E. Lee. But when the South lost Jackson, they lost.
And that's the nature of war.
Mm-hmm.
It's the unfortunate nature of war is, some leaders are going to get lost as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I would concur that he's an admirable general. But to me, as a modern military officer, I hold Grant probably in the highest regard.
Oh, absolutely.
Just because of the nature of how he conducted the war. He's looking into the future. He's making political connections and all kinds of connections. Now, maybe Lincoln's helping him with that. But that's a modern American general. And it sets the stage not only for the Civil War, but for generals to follow, whether it's Sheridan or whoever were mentored by him. And then it just sets the stage for the U.S. Army from that point forward.
Yeah, and I think in the Civil War that the generals that in the Union Army, they were developed over that
no question
4 years, and the ones that did very well were well developed. In the Confederacy, when they lost someone, there was very, very little to replace them because so many brigadiers lost their lives leading troops.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so. But it's interesting because the Germans came over in the 20s and studied the Civil War. And what did they study? Sherman's Atlanta campaign and Grant's Vicksburg campaign. But they also liked Nathan Bedford Forrest. And if you look at those three generals, they were often striking from different angles and very quickly. They didn't stop. And so what's the Blitzkrieg all about? Well, Heinz Guderian coming over to the American South in the 1920s.
Well, and the idea that Grant is like constant pressure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I can definitely see that. And the aggressiveness of Forrest and Sherman of constant pressure. And that becomes obviously tenets of their military.
Especially Sherman in the Atlanta campaign, the March to the Sea, where he would fan out.
Absolutely amazing.
Fan out in that long. And if you attacked any one of his corps, they would go around and
army
flank
at
everyone.
That point is the most seasoned. It's not always disciplined, but it's seasoned. It's battle hardened. They're living off the land.
Yeah.
That's about the most powerful American army, at least at that point. Maybe you can line up with most. Now, granted, there's more technological advancements and so forth, but that army at that point in the world Sherman's army had to be at the apex of armies in the entire world.
Very, very formidable, no question about it. I do have one other topic that we might take on sometime, and that's John Logan, because I'm fascinated by General Logan because of his politics and how they changed, but also I would argue he was the best of the political generals who were generally
not good,
dismal.
Right.
Yeah. So another topic for another day.
I really appreciate it, Dr. Jacobs. I want to thank our guest today, Dr. Tim Jacobs, for the interesting and astounding tale of the sword and the wall, and then a continued discussion about the Civil War and Grant. That always is going to be interesting. Our featured beer was Stan the Man's classic No. 6 American Lager from the Urban Chestnut Brewing Company. Remember to subscribe, leave a comment, and your chance to win a gift card from Hy-Vee. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, which is available on iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, anywhere you download your music. Thank you, and please join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.